So I was asked to comment on the murder of Ryan Carson. Ryan Carson is a man who was living in New York City, and one night was out out late with his girlfriend at some sort of formal event, and they attempted to walk past a man on the sidewalk who was kicking over other people's property. And when the man looked up and saw them, he immediately said that he would kill them right then, something to that effect. Took out a knife and began trying to stab Ryan Carson to death. Ryan Carson tripped over the bench he had just been sitting on, and that gave the killer the opportunity to move in and stab him to death. It was the killer ran away, and it was a wholly and completely unnecessary act of murder, heartless, inhuman murder. And the man accused of doing it, Brian Dowling, is now in custody without bail. So there's been a lot. This is should be a fairly clear-cut case of right and wrong, even if Brian Dowling is, yes, suffering from mental health issues or has otherwise been failed by the system. He still does not have the right to cross the line into cold-blooded murder. And so things must be, justice must be pursued and must be carried out. And you would think that this would be a fairly open and shut case, but in our current society, everything has to have wide-reaching social implications, especially considering that one of the people involved in this was white and one of them was black. In this case, the black person is the killer and the white person is the victim. And so, given our current climate in which we have to, reading way, way, way too much into everything is our default position, we have the pundits of the world have taken their own very very, I don't want to say outlandish because it's not outlandish for them, but their very own polarized positions, as we could expect. And so, in being asked to comment on this, I know I'm asked to provide some additional perspective. And certainly, again, I don't think there's anything specific to the situation itself that I can provide, because I do think in this case it is in terms of the specifics of what happened, this is a fairly open and shut case of who is culpable in the situation and who the victim is, etc. What I wanted to talk about a little bit, I noticed that the way, there's been there's been a very odd sort of response to on the part of those associated with the victim, as I should say. People who were friends and close associates of Ryan are saying that Ryan would have thought that his attacker would have had compassion for his attacker and thought that he was the victim of a broken system. Of course, conservative pundits are balking at that notion and decrying liberalism as a mental health disorder, and that sort of thing. And there's been even more. There is, to be fair, to be reasonable in that, there is an unreasonable, indefensible level of kind of gratuitous benevolence being extended to Brian Dowling and all of this, where we've got things like his Ryan Carson's girlfriend is apparently she was not able to pick the killer out of a lineup and some things, and she's not been cooperative with police, and she's known to be an all cops are bastards person, known to be a defund the police kind of person, not cooperating in the carrying out of justice. And so it's not without reason that some of these conservative talking heads have been pointing out how deranged it is that there are these people that seem to be willing to sacrifice themselves and their loved ones to vile, despicable people for the sake of for the sake of pushing a very extreme political agenda that likes to pretend that all of the problems of the world that would be solved by law enforcement and military intervention and all of that are actually magically non-existent, and they're all totally fictionalized things made up by some, the military industrial complex and all of this stuff. And we used to hear about this a lot. Hear stories about things like very ideologically deranged, let's say, young college women doing things like deciding to go backpacking in Afghanistan because they think that the dangers posed to women there are all just a bunch of military government propaganda, and it's actually safe and wonderful over there, only to be found raped and murdered almost immediately. We run into things like that. And it's not for nothing that we accuse such people of abdicating good common sense. But I wanted to try to, in light of that, rather than try to say that liberalism is, as Matt Walsh was just describing, leftism as a mind virus and that sort of thing, I want to try to instead say that there is a very reasonable, logical, and practical application for Christian morality here that people seem to be losing out on. On the far right, as typified by like the people at the Daily Wire that I've criticized and everything. On the far right, you have people. I don't want to. I struggle to call Daily Wire far right because far right implies things like Nazism and fascism. But the ultra conservative right, like the Daily Wire, they espouse this very bizarre concept of Christianity that, in their minds, in the minds of people like Matt Walsh and Michael Knowles and Candace Owens and all of these people, when a person does wrong, they believe that the Christian response to that is to drag the person through, public derision and public crucifixion and subject them to the 2 minutes hate. They essentially believe in doing to the accused, behaving towards the accused exactly in the way. Treating them exactly in the way that Christ was unjustly treated. They have this heinous bloodlust, this insatiable bloodlust to such a degree that they routinely and regularly applaud anybody who engages in any act of vigilante dipshittery, no matter how uncalled for it is. On that end, you have that bizarre militaristic view of interpretation of Christianity that really isn't an interpretation of Christianity at all. It's just a complete throwing out of all Christian ideals whatsoever, and just making Christianity into some kind of Catholic fashion statement that you adorn yourself with while you go about continuing to espouse vicious hatred and derision towards your enemies. Then on the other side, and so in light of that, by the way, it's certainly no surprise that left-wing people would pull back hard against a Christianity like that. In that case, you're reminded of what Gandhi said about, I love Christ, but I don't like Christians. They're so unlike your Christ. That's who he's referring to when he talks about that. And when he says that, and there's not really that surprising to see left-wing oriented people pulling back from that. On the left, however, you have this other bizarre three-ring circus that looks nothing like actual Christianity, where they are so terrified, so insanely terrified of being accused of being anything like the right-wing Christians over here, of having any semblance, any resemblance to them whatsoever. They're so terrified of that they have abdicated all. They've abdicated all pretense of having any kind of position about anything, and have kind of just knelt down and opened themselves up to a ongoing and unrelenting stream of political outrage bukkake, where every left-leaning every left-leaning activist group is allowed to come mutate Christianity and their Christianity into a into a a bastion of their political agenda and that sort of thing. And I've commented on the absurd lengths that they've gone to accommodate the extreme of the LGBT movement to such a degree that just telling such people, you are absolutely welcome to come worship with us and we're okay with your sexual orientation. That's not good enough. Instead, they have to do like the Church of England has done and allow their worship services to be bastardized to the point of looking like some sort of gay interpretation of the mansion party scene in Eyes Wide Shut. So these are the absurd polarities that we're dealing with. But what could really help us respond to this would be just mere Christianity. And the person to look to put some perspective on this, would be the author of Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis. Now, I'm going to read a passage from Mere Christianity. He's going to end this. He's going to he's going to talk about the death penalty and being in favor of the death penalty. I want to clarify that I am not in favor of the death penalty for a whole multitude of reasons. And by the way, if you're going to write to me and ask about how I could ever possibly be pro-choice and anti-death penalty, I already did a video on that. Don't waste my time. Go watch it. Anyway. So, I want to read this passage and then kind of discuss how it applies to what's going on here. So, just to skip ahead a little bit, he starts out by talking about how the basis for Christian love, the way we are taught to love as Christians, is to say, love thy neighbor as you love yourself. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And he points out that when Christ said that, he was not saying anything new, merely he was pointing to a universal truth that we had always kind of understood and always kind of felt like we were somehow living in defiance of. Now, the deeper explanation of that is buttressed by everything that comes before this. This is fairly deep into Mere Christianity, by everything that comes before it. And if you haven't read Mere Christianity, I highly recommend you read it. I believe it is public domain, which is supported by the fact that it's so widely available for free, including recordings of the audiobook and that kind of thing. But read Mere Christianity. But I want to get to this part. So he talks about thinking the best way to understand love thy neighbor as you love yourself comes from stopping and thinking about what it means to love yourself. He says, now that I come to think of it, I have not got exactly a feeling of fondness or affection for myself, and I do not even always enjoy my own society. So apparently love your neighbor does not mean feel fond of him or find him attractive. I ought to have seen that before because, of course, you cannot feel fond of a person by trying. Do I think well of myself, think myself a nice chap? Well, I'm afraid sometimes I do, and those are no doubt my worst moments. But that is not why I love myself. In fact, it is the other way around. My self-love makes me think myself nice, but thinking myself nice is not why I love myself. So loving my enemies does not apparently mean thinking nice of them either. That is an enormous relief. For a good many people imagine that forgiving your enemies means making out that they are really not such bad fellows after all, when it is quite plain that they are. Go a step further. In my most clear-sighted moments, I not only do I think myself a nice man, but I know that I am a very nasty one. I can look at some of the things I have done with horror and loathing. So apparently I am allowed to loathe and hate some of the things that my enemies do. Now that I come to think of it, I remember Christian teachers telling me long ago that I must hate a bad man's actions but not hate the bad man, or as they would say, hate the sin but not the sinner. For a long time I used to think this a silly, straw-splitting distinction. How could you hate what a man did and not hate the man? But years later it occurred to me that there was one man to whom I had been doing this all my life, namely myself. However much I might dislike my own cowardice or conceit or greed, I went on loving myself. There had never been the slightest difficulty about it. In fact, the very reason why I hated the things was that I loved the man. Just because I loved myself, I was sorry to find that I was the sort of man who did those things. Consequently, Christianity does not want us to reduce by one atom the hatred we feel for cruelty and treachery. We ought to hate them. Not one word of what we have said about them needs to be unsaid, but it does want us to hate them in the same way in which we hate things about ourselves, being sorry that the man should have done such things, and hoping, if it is in any way possible, that somehow, sometime, somewhere, he can be cured and made human again. The real test is this. Suppose one reads a story of filthy atrocities in the paper. Then suppose that something turns up suggesting that the story might not be quite true, or not quite so bad as it was made out. Is one's first feeling, thank God, even they aren't quite so bad as that? Or is it a feeling of disappointment and even a determination to cling to the first story for the sheer pleasure of thinking your enemies as bad as possible? If it is the second, then it is, I am afraid, the first step in a process which, if followed to the end, will make us into devils. You see, one is beginning to wish that the black was a little blacker. If we give that wish its head, later on we shall wish to see gray as black, and then to see white itself as black. Finally, we shall insist on seeing everything, God and friends and ourselves included, as bad and not able to do anything about it. We shall be fixed forever in a universe of pure hatred. Now a step further. Does loving your enemy mean not punishing him? No, for loving myself does not mean that I ought to subject myself to punishment, even to death. No, for loving myself does not mean that I ought not to subject myself to punishment, even to death. If you had committed a murder, the right Christian thing to do would be to give yourself up to the police and be hanged. It is, therefore, in my opinion, perfectly right for a Christian judge to sentence a man to death, or a Christian soldier to kill an enemy. I always have thought so ever since I became a Christian, and long before the war, World War II, I and II, and still think so now that we are at peace. It is no good quoting "Thou shalt not kill." There are two Greek words, the ordinary word to kill and the word to murder. And when Christ quotes the commandment, he uses the murder one in all three accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I am told there is the same distinction in Hebrew. All killing is not murder any more than all sexual intercourse is adultery. When soldiers came to St. John the Baptist asking what to do, he never remotely suggested that they ought to leave the army, nor did Christ when he met a Roman sergeant major, what they called a centurion. The idea of the knight, the Christian in arms for the defense of a good cause, is one of the great Christian ideas. War is a dreadful thing, and I can respect an honest pacifist, though I think he is entirely mistaken. What I cannot understand is the sort of semi-pacifism you get nowadays, which gives people the idea that though you have to fight, you ought to do it with a long face as if you were ashamed of it. It is that feeling that robs lots of magnificent young Christians in the service of something they have the right to do, something which is the natural accompaniment of courage, a kind of gaiety and wholeheartedness. I have often thought to myself how it would feel if, when I served in the First World War, I and some young German had killed each other simultaneously and found ourselves together a moment after death. I cannot imagine that either of us would have felt any resentment or even any embarrassment. I think we might have laughed over it. I imagine somebody will say, well, if one is allowed to condemn the enemy's acts and punish him and kill him, what difference is left between Christian morality and the ordinary view? All the difference in the world. Remember, we Christians think man lives forever. Therefore, what really matters is those little marks or twists on the central inside part of the soul, which are going to turn it in the long run into a heavenly or a hellish creature. We may kill if necessary, but we must not hate and enjoy hating. We may punish if necessary, but we must not enjoy it. In other words, something inside us, the feeling of resentment, the feeling that wants to get one's own back, must be simply killed. I do not mean that anyone can decide this moment that he will never feel it anymore. That is not how things happen. I mean that every time it bobs its head up, day after day, year after year, all our lives long, we must hit it on the head. It is hard work, but the attempt is not impossible. Even while we kill and punish, we must try to feel about the enemy as we feel about ourselves, to wish that he were not bad, to hope that he may, in this world or another, be cured. In fact, to wish his good. That is what is meant in the Bible by loving him, wishing his good, not feeling fond of him, nor saying he is nice when he is not. I admit that this means loving people who have nothing lovable about them. But then, has oneself anything lovable about it? You love it simply because it is yourself. God intends us to love all selves in the same way and for the same reason. But he has given us the sum ready worked out in our own case to show us how it works. We have then to go on and apply the rule to all the other selves. Perhaps it makes it easier if we remember that is how he loves us, not for any nice, attractive qualities we think we have, but just because we are things called selves. For really, there is nothing else in us to love, creatures like us who actually find hatred such a pleasure that to give it up is like giving up beer or tobacco. And so, I thought about that passage as I thought about the Ryan Carson situation, because contained in all of that is, I think, the Christianity that is absent in both the left and the right, in both how the left and the right are responding to this. Obviously, people like Matt Walsh and Michael Knowles and Candace Owens, the militant extreme arm of the Daily Wire and all of that, they are filled with that first and primary hatred that Lewis is describing, that inability to distinguish hatred of the person from hatred of what the person has done. They feel entitled to hate the person because of what the person has done, and that is strictly against what Lewis is describing. And, you know, the only time that people like Michael Knowles and Candace Owens seem to be able to muster any kind of love, innate love for the fundamental essence of humanity, for the basic selfhood of the individual, is when it comes to stopping a woman from getting an abortion. Then they're all about it. But as soon as it ceases to be convenient to their agenda, they shovel that under the rug and go back to whipping and castigating the vermin that they see as being so deeply beneath them. So we see that there, but we see deeper in what Lewis is talking about the what is bringing about the intellectual and spiritual failing of the people who are trying to find some way to make Brian Dowling out to be a victim in this situation as well. There's no doubt that Brian Dowling, as I said, was failed by the system, but the problem is that the people who are saying that are afraid to admit that Ryan Carson was failed by the system as well. So, in applying Lewis's ideas to this situation, I noticed one of the articles I read as I was kind of prepping myself on this situation to talk about it. I noticed that one of the articles that covered this situation quoted somebody that was saying that there was no good outcome on either side of this situation. On the one side, Ryan Carson was dead, and on the other side, Brian Dowling is going to spend the rest of his life in jail. And they said there was just no good outcome on either side. No, absolutely not. No, now granted, Brian Dowling has not been found guilty yet. He is He still waits to stand trial before the bar of law, and he remains officially not guilty until then, but for sake of discussion, we will proceed as though he is. Brian Dowling being brought to justice, or indeed just the killer of Ryan Carson being brought to justice, is a good moral outcome on that side. The restoration of restoration brought about, I'm sorry, the social restoration brought about by justice is the good outcome on that side. It's the good outcome on both sides. It is a very cravenous and cowardly, morally cowardly thing a person does to try to say that both, to try to equate the person who has been murdered and the person who is facing justice for that murder, who's being brought to justice for that murder, trying to say that they're trying to draw some moral equivalence between them, is heinous and despicable. To quote somebody that to borrow from somebody who in a lot of ways, in fact, in nearly every way, would be C.S. Lewis's opposite, I could quote Ayn Rand in the John Galt speech, who says that, there are two sides in every conflict. One side is right and the other side is wrong, but it is the knave in the middle who insists that the right and the wrong meet each other halfway that is evil. That's what allows evil to happen, allows evil to occur. And as she put it, in any compromise between food and poison, it is only death that can win out. And that's what's happening there. That's the error in their thinking. By being so afraid of condemning what Brian Dowling did as being fundamentally evil, they are now at the point of drawing a moral equivalency, trying to draw a moral equivalency between the negative outcome for Ryan Carson and the negative outcome for the person who maliciously did that to him. So that fundamentally is the wrongness of their thinking there and the wrongness of their morality. But what are they casting about for? They're casting about for, as they try to talk about, they try to shape Brian Dowling as being some kind of victim. The girlfriend of his victim going out of her way to stymie the police investigation and things like that. What are they trying to do there? They're trying to affect a fundamentally secular version of something, of a facet of morality that belongs within the province of God. There is a reason why this idea of forgiving our sins as we forgive those who trespass against us, of forgiveness for our enemies, as there's a reason that is a level of morality so sacred it has to be in the province of God. The reason for that is because fundamentally, as human beings, we're incapable of doing that. We don't do that to please God. We don't forgive our enemies we don't forgive our enemies to please God. We forgive our enemies with the help of God. It is through God that we hand all of that over. I had an experience one time when I was driving Uber that I don't want to recount the circumstances of it too much because it would be very upsetting. But it was a situation where I was surrounded by a gang of people that were trying to they were trying to get me out of my car, I was in a very tense situation where I thought I was, I really thought I was about to face serious harm. I don't want to recount the circumstances too much. It was a very disturbing event. But I got out of the situation. Basically, I had to just find out whether or not they were willing to move if I started driving, and thank God they were. Got out of the situation, went to the police. I don't want to talk anymore about it. But as far as as far as how I felt about that situation, I had been back in the Christian faith for a couple of years at that point, and I decided that I was going to make it my project in prayer to forgive those people. Nothing that they did was honorable or decent. There was no thread of humanity within those people that would have warranted forgiveness. But every day when I went to prayer and told God that I wanted to forgive them, and I kept on forgiving them in my prayers until I was able to move forward. Until I was no longer racked with the anger and the pain and the anguish of what happened there. And like I said, I don't want to go into any details because it's actually it got a lot more serious than what I just described. It was a very scary situation. Anyway, it's, as Lewis says earlier in that passage, we all think forgiveness is a great idea until we have something to forgive. And that's where I found myself with that situation. I realized that forgiveness, it's not just something you snap your fingers and it goes away. It's a long, ongoing commitment to a process. But fundamentally, it's a process that happens with the grace of God. There's this, there's this thing that a lot of atheists will do that you hear from people like the Christopher Hitchens of the world and the Ricky Gervaises of the world and that sort of thing. And this was even something that showed up in that program that I really like. Was it Afterlife or Life After Death? I can't think of the name of it. The series on Netflix that Ricky Gervais did. He even did this in there, which is that someone says, well, if there's no if there's no God, what's going to stop you from raping and murdering? And his response is, well, I'm basically something like, I'm capable of understanding that those things are wrong myself without God, without God's help. I already know those things are wrong and I don't do them. Here's the thing, all of that comes out of that default sense of self-love. There is a secular level of social contract, of interchange within the social contract, where we realize it's to our mutual benefit to not go around raping and murdering, to deal with people decently. Fundamentally, we can work that out on our own. The real question becomes, how are you going to, by what standard are you going to go about forgiving somebody when they have done something to you so heinous that it seems like there's nothing on this earth that could possibly warrant forgiving them? That's where it comes in. That is where fundamentally appealing to the nature of God steps in our morality. And that is why we articulate, that's why we see articulations of Jesus like what C.S. Lewis does, articulations of Jesus being like a solicitor in the court that speaks up on our, intercedes on our behalf. Fundamentally, the thing, human beings have a divided nature, as Nietzsche pointed out. We're halfway between beast and God. We have the cognition and the understanding to see the larger whole of reality and comprehend it, but we still have a fundamental nature that is aligned with the self-interest of the lower animals, the bestial self-interest of the lower animals. And we have to have a way to reconcile those two things. And fundamentally, we have to make a choice to appeal to our higher nature. And that higher nature remains, in a lot of ways, fundamentally, as long as we have that bestial, that connection to the lower animals, that higher nature remains fundamentally removed from all of us. And this might seem like a wide derivation out of the discussion of Ryan Carson and all of that. But what I'm trying to get at is that these people who are trying to say, say, oh, Brian Dowling was the victim of a system that failed him, etc., etc., and they're trying to say they're trying to draw some sort of moral equivalency between the punishment, the deserved punishment that awaits this person, the killer of Ryan Carson, and the killing of Ryan Carson. They know that there is a higher morality to which they are called. They are right to call themselves to a higher morality than that which is practiced by the bloodthirsty elitists over at the Daily Wire and those right-wing pundits that are so awful. They are right to want to aspire to something better than that. They are right to want a better world than the eye for an eye, kill or be killed, dog eat dog world that the militant right-wing ultra-conservatives want to live in. They are right to want something better than that. But as they try to articulate that better concept without a deference to the larger whole of God and the greater good of God, that's when they start coming off like these lunatic hippies that seem ready to sacrifice themselves on the altar of leftist collectivism. That's where all of that comes from. If they if a person said, there's already been one sacrifice for the forgiveness of sins, we don't need any more, then a very different morality presents itself. A real liberal, and I don't mean liberal politically, I mean liberal in a socially liberal mindset, could better assert itself under the auspices of Christianity. Under the auspices of Christianity, left-leaning progressive type people have done some incredible things. The one that I like to cite is when I lived in Mississippi, the priest at the Episcopal church that we went to was Duncan Gray III, whose father was, of course, Duncan Gray II. Duncan Gray II is famous because when oh God, I'm forgetting very important historical names all of a sudden. When the federal government integrated James Meredith, that's it, integrated James Meredith into Ole Miss, into the University of Mississippi, there were riots in the streets, horrible riots in the streets. And people were destroying property, burning things down, burning in effigy, all kinds of violence was going on and all sorts of things. Duncan Gray II was one of the people who walked the street, who walked through the University of Mississippi campus, and he wore his collar so that they would know they were, because he knew these are people who would calm down in the presence of a holy man. And so he wore his collar and he walked the streets telling these people who are rioting, calming them down, telling them to go home, getting them calmed down, and just not trying to be Antifa bashing the racists and the baddies, just trying to reach these people on a human level, get them to calm down and go home for the night so that we can move on to the next day. That's all we're trying to do here. And that is the real Christian, that is an example of real Christian courage, and something that happens, I think something that people are able to do when they walk in Christ. Matt Walsh would tell you, and I say this because I was watching Matt Walsh's commentaries on this incident. He's been making, if you look up, Matt Walsh has a video called How Stereotyping Can Save Your Life, talking about this situation. And it basically boils down to him talking about how he avoids black men at night and things like that. And he would have told you, if we were talking about the situation I just described with Duncan II, he would have told you that that in a situation like that, oh, you shouldn't be going out like that, that will get you killed. You have to think about your own self-preservation. It's that'll get you killed, which when you start to really articulate, it starts to seem very cravenous and anti-Christian, which is because most of the Christianity espoused by the people at the Daily Wire is cravenous and anti-Christian. But anyway, that shows the difference, and that's what's missing. Is not, on both sides of the aisle, Christianity has gotten to be more about the proponents of left-wing and right-wing Christianity have come to care more about the number of butts and seats and the number and how they look from a public relations standpoint than they have about really preaching something that is good and useful and beneficial to people. And I would hope, even as a, dare I say, lay theologian, which basically just means somebody that's spouting his own opinion about Christianity, I would hope that that's made some kind of sense and some kind of difference. That there is a very important philosophical and philosophical medium between these two disparate moralities, that we can have a just and civilized society and will the good of the other. We can will for a situation. This is another one of many reasons why I'm opposed to the death penalty. The death penalty eliminates the what should be the most desired possibility, which is that the killer of Ryan Carson can find a way to come to terms with confront the reality of what he has done and truly seek spiritual forgiveness and hopefully become in some small way a better person and a force for good in the world. If we kill him, we eliminate that possibility altogether. So that's just one of many reasons. But anyway, so that is what is missing. Trying to bend over backwards, making excuses, making every excuse in the world for what Ryan Carson's killer did, trying to make every excuse in the world for what he did, is just knowing that there is a higher level of morality you need to aspire to within yourself, and not having the spiritual tools that you need to live up to it. So, I think a lot of the reason that people wanted to throw off Christianity is one, for very understandable reasons. The groups that were incessantly pushing things like teaching creationism and intelligent design in schools, the asinine draconian sexual moralities of various conservative groups, things like that. I understand wanting to push away from that, but you threw the baby out with the bathwater. There is a level of human decency that I really think is only possible in the hands of, in the guidance of the hands of God. And that's what's really missing on both sides in this discussion.